Greetings, fellow thinkers and drinkers. Now, in a recent conversation in relation to this channel, the subject of Iron Maiden came up. This was swiftly followed by the obvious question, how do I rate them? And in truth, I had to think about this. Back in the day, in my formative years, I really did like them. Though I was never as invested in them as, say, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Rush, etc., etc. However, I was forced to confess that since the very early 90s, my interest had, significantly and quite dramatically declined. Yet for some reason, I still continued to pick up their albums, most of them at least. But it's something I have to confess, I very rarely listen to. And I have to say the relationship that was once quite strong has had soured, shall we say. We'd gone our separate ways. Why? Well, they lost their appeal, I guess. Music became duller, more repetitive, I think. Not bad, shall I say. Less inspired, or that was my view. And as the conversation developed, the further question was asked, well, did they change or did you? Yeah, fair enough. A legitimate question. Which I admitted, I accepted the premise of, but I supplemented it by saying, well, yes, I accept that, but one could also say that the band really did, especially in the latter half of their career, fail to live up to their potential. And they didn't go on to become that great musical entity that I think they perhaps could have been. Which is effectively the subject of this video. I'm not going to review each album in detail. I assume prior knowledge if you're watching this. So this is not going to be an in-depth review of each of their recorded efforts. I will just be making brief points here and there to support my thesis, as it were. This is more a review of their musical journey as a whole, for which I have broken their career down into three distinct phases. So the first phase being, let's call it the golden years. Okay, they started, 1980. Well, their first album came out in 1980. Their debut, Iron Maiden. Now, this is one of those things, it's often seen as a leading light in the somewhat nebulous term that is the new wave of British heavy metal. There's endless debates as to when that started, what it actually is, what its defining features are, who forms part of this, etc., etc. I don't really care. But Maiden were seen as one of the leading lights of that movement, shall we say, sort of a cut above most of the other acts involved. And I'm not saying here, they were better than Saxon or better than Angel Witch or better than Diamond Head. That's not the point. It's not actually the matter under discussion. But they certainly went on to the most recognized and most commercially and critically successful of just about all the acts. One could argue perhaps Def Leppard, but to me that's just too far away from anything interesting. To really be considered. But no, I mean, that's, effectively where, where they came from. And their debut release was a very potent release. It's raw, it's punkish, it's got great songs on it, holds up really well to this day. Again, was it particularly revelatory to what was going on at the time? But it was a quality release. Certainly was. And as I said, I still think it holds up to this day. It has a raw, punkish energy to it that, I think suits it really well. The production was a bit rough, perhaps, but it fits. It's gritty. It suits the music. They followed it up quickly enough with Killers, which was obviously the last album to feature Paul Di'Anno. Again, it's rough. It's still very punky. Still, street music, rock music, metal music, however you want to define that. Better production. The first time they worked with Martin Birch, so, a serious producer who's, cut his teeth on everything from Deep Purple to Black Sabbath. and you can tell it sounds better. Now, for some, this is a favorite. You know, some people tell you it's one of the best things they ever recorded. I don't quite see it that way. Some really good stuff on it. The title track, Murders in the Rue Morgue, but also some stuff. You get the feeling some stuff that didn't make the cut for the first album, leftovers, almost. Some filler, Prodigal Son, Genghis Khan, I don't know. To me, it lacked that, there were too many songs on it that were good, but not great. But anyway, that's just my opinion. When, Di'Anno left, he was replaced by Bruce Dickinson, and for many, this is where the story actually does start. The difference, between Killers and Number of the Beast. Well, again, I don't have to tell you this. But it was like a switch had been flipped. Songwriting had become more ambitious, it had matured. Adrian Smith was making his presence felt. Steve Harris had effectively wrote the material up until this point. Dickinson, although not credited, was making his presence felt, not only as a singer-songwriter whose range and just all-round vocal abilities were vastly superior in any technical sense to Paul Di'Anno, but also as a songwriter. This is the one that established him. This is the one that put them in the leading lights of the new wave of British heavy metal. This is the one that put them on the path to fame and the riches, and where the majority of the other bands in that movement, they got nowhere near it. It's a great album. There is. I may argue on any given day that songs like Invaders or Gangland are perhaps not quite up to par, but no, it's a fantastic piece of work, and it's rightly held today. For the classic it is. They followed that up obviously with Peace of Mind. Now again, in terms of production, this is one of Martin Birch's finest efforts. In terms of songwriting, this is very consistent at very, very high level. And you can see that that's a word that will come up a lot, their formula is beginning to solidify what defines an Iron Maiden song or an Iron Maiden album. I think it's here where it really, you can say the formula has solidified. It's really taken hold. Lacks the rawness, perhaps, of the first two, but that is more than compensated for by the proficiency and the intricacy and the greatness, shall we say, of the songwriting. Again, some people may say songs like "Quest for Fire" or "Sun and Steel" are a bit weaker. I actually like them. I don't see that, and in many ways, it remains my favorite of their albums. They followed up with Power Slave. Now, this is actually, going back in the timeline, this is where I joined the party. I think my first exposure to them would have been the 2 Minutes to Midnight single. And I quickly got the album, and I quickly got the back catalogue. Again, is this, you could easily say this is the high point of their 80s output. There's just so many classics on it. And in Rime of the Ancient Mariner, they were showing that there was more to them than your average metal band. They were getting ambitious. And that's great, but ambition is only good if you have the talent to back it up, and they were showing that they very much did. There's a 15-minute song here that did not get boring. Mark those words. However, there was the instrumental, wasn't there? Lost for words. Okay. And I have to say that something about Back in the Village I always thought was a bit weak. And I suppose looking back in hindsight, one could start to see that there was a little bit of repetition of idea and execution going on, but that's maybe only with the benefit of jaundiced, perhaps, hindsight. I don't know. Look, after that, they released their now legendary live album, Live After Death. And live albums have a way in bands' careers of being, a punctuation mark, that something different was going to happen after it. And it did and it didn't, really, didn't it? When they recorded the follow-up, Somewhere in Time, there was some division in the band. Bruce Dickinson wanted them to, go Led Zeppelin and, not necessarily record an acoustic album, but to say, okay, we've established ourselves with this, let us develop, let us progress. The others were perhaps, when I say the others, Steve Harris was perhaps not so keen on that idea, but they did make some concessions to somebody in some way and started incorporating guitar synths into their sound, which actually was not, worked out rather well. However, this did start to sound a little recycled in places. Caught Somewhere in Time is a strong opener, but again, you're starting to see that within the construction of the song, there's a lot of repetition. You could have shaved a minute off it, and it may have been stronger. Wasted Years, kind of commercial for them, but very good song. I really do like Sea of Madness. Heaven Can Wait's kind of catchy, upbeat. Great live track. But you're starting on stuff like The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. It's starting to get repetitive musically. Not only have we heard this type of thing before, but within the song, it keeps repeating the same refrains and licks and musical ideas. It's a bit formulaic and it's not that inspired. Stranger in a Strange Land I always thought was a bit plodding. Deja Vu I thought was decent, but it could have come from anybody, really. And then we get to Alexander the Great. Now, this is one people get very excited about, and, we were very enthusiastic when they eventually played this live for the first time a couple of years ago. I have to say, I don't get the joke here. I think this is lyrically very poor. Amateur, There's a very, writing prose is a skill. Writing lyrics is a different skill. The requirements of a lyric is very different to the requirements of prose, but these prose narrative storytelling type of lyrics are really not very good. As it was one of Steve Harris's efforts, if I recall correctly, and he does not seem to have the lyrical flair to, He wrote great lyrics on other songs. The Trooper comes to mind, or something like that. But with this, this prose, this narrative, he didn't have the lyrical chops, the literary chops, to make that convincing. But it's just one of those things. It plods, doesn't it? Its chorus is overused. Again, that word repetition will recur. But yeah, I don't know. To me, these were the first signs of where the band were ultimately going to go. To some, this is a masterpiece. I'm afraid I didn't get it at the time, and I've never really warmed to it as an album. However, when they came back with Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, which, all right, something of a concept album, perhaps, no doubt, but it was a great return to form as far as I was concerned. Really strong songs all the way through. Some nice variety in it. Perhaps the pinnacle of their songwriting in the 1980s. I don't know. Debatable point. Again, where I'm going to take this is the only sort of red flags that were the title track, which was overly long. And again, overly repetitive, both musically and, Bruce's constant seventh sound of a seventh sound, Worrying trait, if you say. I mean, but all these albums, they were very ambitious. They were melodic yet powerful. They were compelling. They were relevant. And the band had evolved. Retained their heaviness. But the point is, they were still writing really good songs. And as a result, producing really good albums. Now, I was on board to this point, and I saw them on this tour live for I think the only time I've seen them. Yeah. And, okay, it's a long time ago. I remember being impressed. They had that, theatricality about them on stage, which some bands can pull off and others cannot. Okay, we move on to the second phase of their career, which I will call the decline. They decided to, as a follow-up, that the next album, No Prayer for the Dying, was going to be, outwent the synthesizers and the grand concepts and that. This was going to be a back-to-basics approach. Well, the other thing that happened was that Adrian Smith left. The band was replaced by Yannick Gers. And Smith, I think his absence was noticed. Okay, as I said, a conscious decision. They're going to, strip it back, go back to basics. Fair enough. It's a reasonable idea. But like with all ideas, it very much comes down to the execution, does it not? And here this fell really flat. The production, still with Martin Birch at this point, but the production is let's just say, flat and underwhelming. And again, I have to say, when it comes to the songwriting, Adrian Smith's departure really hurt them, I think. Too many tracks sound rushed and generic, very uneven. Flow to the album. Even talking about the sequencing, it didn't quite work. I mean, there's a couple of tracks. "Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter," one could argue was a little bit of fun, and it did get them to #1 in the UK singles chart. But considering the shit that's achieved that particular honor, again, it's just one of those things that doesn't bother me too much. However, Mother Russia was embarrassing, and this is generally seen as one of their weaker releases. But it the drop off in quality between Seventh Son and this is immense. It really is. This is not a steady decline. They really fell off the edge here. It sounded like that they were creatively in a rut, and certainly lacking in inspiration. Well, they followed it up with "Fear of the Dark," which has its moments, and like the title track has been ever present in the live set ever since, to the consternation of many, I believe. But overall, this was another uneven effort. It was a stronger effort, I have to say, and certainly this is the last album that Martin Birchwood produced with the band, but it was a production worthy of his abilities, shall we say. "Be Quick or Be Dead," "Afraid to Shoot Strangers," certainly better than anything on "No Prayer for the Dying." And again, this was another success, I believe. Got to #1 in the UK, and they were still selling product. They'd reached that level of commercial success, as I said, hardly any other of those new wave bridge heavy metal bands ever did. But there's a couple of things on here, as the "Weekend Warrior," "Chains of Misery." How weak they really are. Anyway, this marked the end of an era, for reasons I cannot be bothered to go into. Bruce Dickinson left the band. But you have to say that although this may have been an improvement on No Prayer for the Dying, there was no musical development. They were recycling the same thing. It's just the ideas happened to work better than they did on the predecessor. The formula had now been entrenched, not just being established. And I think it was starting to hurt that, if we accept that this was, how they were going to go about things, that they'd mined it dry almost. Perhaps the lack of willingness to develop was starting to hurt, and sticking to that formula, well, all the great ideas seems to have been behind them at this stage. And it turned out this was the last album I bought for many years. I completely lost interest in them at this point. That's fair enough. Not just their fault. Obviously my tastes were changing and developing, but I was just not interested in them anymore. And when I listened to them, I just listened to their back catalogue, which I continue to, and I continue to this day. Obviously, there's a lot worse material out there than these last two albums. It's just one has to understand that they set their own bar, very high, and so the drop off in quality was very, very noticeable. They replaced Bruce Dickinson with Blaze Bayley of Wolfsbane. Never heard them, but I just do not like this guy's voice. I've heard him in nothing apart from these two Iron Maiden albums. I thought he has a very ordinary sounding voice, and obviously he has very limited vocal range and prowess, I have to say. Hindsight is obviously a wonderful thing, but you have to question the wisdom of hiring him in the first place, because it must have been patently obvious to all that he would be utterly incapable of singing the majority of the back catalogue. Dickinson famous for his operatic wail. There's just no way Bailey could have carried that off. I'll give you a comparison. When Black Sabbath replaced Ozzy Osbourne with Ronnie James Dio, Dio had the vocal chops, technically, and everything that was required. He could sing the Osbourne material. There was no challenge for him in that regard. One may debate his interpretations, but he had the ability to sing the songs. That could not have happened the other way. Osbourne could never have replaced Dio. He just does not have the voice. And I think this is very similar situation here. It's a very bizarre decision, I have to say. I do believe Doogie White, who then went on to what at the time was the last incarnation of Rainbow with Richie Blackmore. Now, again, personal preferences, to one side. He did have the necessary vocal abilities. He could have carried Dickinson's stuff off pretty, well, I would have thought. But who knows? Who knows? And I didn't buy these at the time, and I still do not own them. I've listened to them each couple of times, in preparation for this, but yeah, I mean, the X Factor 95 sounds awful. I think the band produced it themselves. Sounds like it. It's just it's overly long, it's overly slow, it's overly uninspired. You've lost two, significant songwriting contributors by this point, Adrian Smith and Bruce Dickinson, and it's obvious, I have to say. There is, so I mentioned the word, repetition, refrains within songs and stuff, but now it's reached chronic proportions. I mean, how many times do you need to repeat the hook line or the title of the song, ad infinitum? And, a lot of these tracks are quite long, as, even, getting to and exceeding 10 minutes. There is nothing on here which would not have been improved by some, judicious pruning. There really isn't. But there's just nothing on here that grabs the attention. They followed it up a couple of years later with Virtual 11, which was in many ways even worse. The songwriting here had deteriorated. And again, the song structures, repetitive, far too long, not going anywhere, meandering, could have been pruned, should have been pruned. Weak lyrics, weak vocals. Commercially, it was, I think, easily their least successful effort. Critically, not well received. Seen as the nadir of the band's career. Yeah. And I have to say, I was not familiar with them particularly before, and I gave both a couple of spins. But I will not be doing that again. And live, obviously, my comments earlier proved to be all too true. And Bailey just couldn't hack it. I mean, I've heard a couple of his efforts at trying to sing some of Bruce's songs, and sorry, he just can't do it. Might be a nice guy, he might be very good at whatever, in other situations. I don't know, but seems to me, obviously not the right choice for this. Then, around 99, 2000, the great reunion. Now, this didn't, like many great reunions, did not come about purely for musical reasons. I mean, what happened to a lot of bands in the mid-90s affected even Iron Maiden. They were selling much less product. They were playing much smaller venues. And I have to say, the quality of music was, in my opinion, had completely gone. So they needed to do something, one could argue. And they eventually Bruce Dickinson and Adrian Smith returned to the band. And in doing so, they kept Yannick Gers on guitar, so now being a three-guitar band. So, why did they keep him? I don't know. Maybe it was loyalty. I got no idea. I have no idea what his contributions to the songwriting process are, but I don't think they're equal to those of Adrian Smith. And live, you either find him really entertaining or completely annoying. Depends on your point of view. And having three guitars in the band, three guitarists in the band, really? But anyway, not my decision. However, this is where perhaps I differ from the majority of people, and it's actually the core of my thesis, as it were, that once they'd got back together, this was the opportunity for them to actually really develop musically and to go on to record those great albums, those great songs, no longer, because they'd reached a stage roughly by now, within a couple of years, where they had nothing left to prove, they could have progressed and developed and and done justice to their talent, shall we say? But they didn't, did they? But these, now they were back on the top. They were now from now on, all these records sell very, very well, and they're back to headlining stadiums. So from that point of view, the reunion paid for itself. Okay, the first thing they delivered was Brave New World in 2000. And yes, the return of Dickinson and Smith in the songwriting makes a noticeable difference. This is a far better effort than either of the last four, especially the last two. And you certainly have the feeling that there is more inspiration going on here. You could argue, and I am going to argue, that it was a bit safe. And I would draw the comparison with Perfect Strangers when Deep Purple reformed. That was pretty safe. However, it's a pretty good album. I don't dislike it per se, but it is overlong. There is filler on it. There is too much overuse, I would say, of mid-tempo structured songs. Some people say the production was too polished. I don't hear that. The lyrical themes by now were starting to be predictable, if not recycled. And as good as some of it is, this really set the pattern for what was to follow. Okay, if they'd always sort of effectively had their formula, the formula going forward would be very much informed by this record. What do I mean by that? Well, they would develop an annoying tendency for extended intros and outros to songs. They would often, long meandering instrumental sections that add length but little direction or meaning. And far too many of these would go on to become interchangeable. It started here. Repetitive chord structures. Many tracks that rely on the same galloping rhythm, for the faster tracks or mid-tempo build-up. You're starting to very much go, I've heard this before. And when it comes to the famous Iron Maiden Gallop, you can go back to Deep Purple in rock and play Hard Loving Woman. Okay? And I'm afraid that's the blueprint for far too many Iron Maiden songs. To the extent that Roger Glover, especially the bass, which informs the Gallop almost, he should almost get writing royalties on these albums. The songs were unnecessarily overstretched in too many places. Routinely, and again, the word is unnecessarily, exceeding 10 minutes. Not from complexity. Not from changes in mood. Not from time changes. No. Repetition. Pure internal repetition. Melodies often circle around the same motifs. You're starting too often to say, oh yeah, I've heard that before, sort of thing. I can't quite name the song, but yeah, okay, yeah. I knew that was coming, I knew that's where they were going to go. It's like playing chess with somebody, and you always know that if you're playing white, and he's black, he's always gonna play the Caro-Kann. It's that sort of thing. Okay, I know what's coming next. Yeah, and lyrical terms, I don't know. It's very much into this, narrative storytelling stuff, which is becoming a little verbose. Again, there is and again, when Dickinson solo stuff, he didn't succumb to this, so one has to assume this is, just internal politics. But I think what's was becoming very apparent is that they're now effectively self-producing. They've got Kevin Shirley on board, or they get him on board at some point soon. But, I think he's there more as a sound engineer and a producer. What they really needed was, an objective, authoritative voice, in the recording studio. Somebody to say, don't be fucking stupid, guys. Come on, But all in all right, it was a good return, shall we say. It certainly showed that the band had life, that they hadn't completely died as a creative force, although couple of years later, we got Dance of Death. Some of the songs are a bit shorty here, which I actually think helps. It's from the start to finish, it makes it slightly easier to listen to. And the first 4 tracks are actually quite strong. Decent effort. Somewhat more up-tempo as well. Quite a lot of it. 2 standouts here, Passchendaele and Journeyman. Neither of which are up-tempo, but they just happen to be really good songs. Real standout songs, actually. Some people went mad about the cover of this, saying it's the worst thing, worst album cover ever or something like. Well, whatever. I mean, I couldn't care less about that. Yeah, there is some filler in this Age of Innocence, perhaps not the greatest effort. But, and I'm getting back to what I've already said, the too many tracks here sounding too familiar in melody, in structure, in rhythm, in dynamics. I said the formula is now entrenched. It really is. Okay, a couple of years later, we get the Matter of Life and Death, isn't it? Again, this is overly long, and this is very heavy going. Very few hooks or immediacy, shall we say, of any of the tracks. Not necessarily a bad thing, a great song doesn't have to grab you immediately, but I find even after repeated listens, there's not much, going on here. Lack of variety is now starting to become apparent again. This is, what you're going to get almost on these albums. And within those structures, some things work better than others on each new release, but there's certainly nothing, new about them. And the quality is starting to suffer, I have to say. But this is just an exhausting almost thing. It's a difficult reach. You've got to work hard to play this from start to finish, I think. And I mentioned earlier, a lot of songs got these sort of acoustic and boom, 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 from bass intros and outros. The repetition of those is now becoming chronic. It really is. A producer is needed at this point to say to Harris, "Fucking stop doing that." I believe this was the album when they toured it. They played it from start to finish. The entire album. When they opened their set with it and played it from start to finish. Christ. That must have been a fun night out. Okay, they get Final Frontier. Again. Very strange opening. What threatens to be quite a dramatic and interesting instrumental just morphs into a very disappointing song. A lot of things on this album, I'm afraid, they just meander. Length and repetition issues again. It's just, we're having this, or at least I'm having the same issues, the same complaints as I have. Going actually, if you think about it, going back a long way. We've heard it all before. They do enough to that you can't say this is the same song they recorded on the last album, and they'll change the words and stuff like that. But I'm afraid it is all overly familiar. And those bloody acoustic introductions again, Christ. I don't know. Maybe they're sponsored by somebody who demands, acoustic introductions to songs or something. Some eccentric billionaire. Who knows? And again, I have to say, this one was probably the first time that the critics actually caught up, because they've been given a free pass because of their status and their standing and anything. But I think the critics are even starting to catch up at this point. Really? Then in 2015, as if to help me make my point, they released this time a double album, if a single album was not enough. The Book of Souls. Now, this is just far too long. It's a very uneven release, and some of the songs just blur together. I mean, you really are struggling to differentiate some of these things. And again, these overextended intros and outros. It's self-parody by this point, but they don't seem to get the joke, because they seem to be taking themselves very seriously. And yeah, this is just not very good. This is boring in places. 2 discs of this, and there's To me, there's just not a particular standout song here. Some of them, I would argue that, with judicious editing, maybe, there are good ideas there. You will hear something that, oh, yeah, that could be promising, but we're talking about excerpts in very long tracks. But most of these songs as a whole just do not work, and as an album, this is a soporific. It really is. Signs of creative fatigue? Who knows? But listening to this, my impression is that never mind the quality, feel the length. Really. And their latest effort to date, Senjutsu from 2021, I'm afraid is very much a replica of the last one. It's slow, badly pacing in it's slow, it's heavy. I don't mean that in a good way. I mean leaden-footed. It lacks urgency. I don't want to say they're going through the motions, but one is tempted to say that. And it is profoundly dull in places. And again, very few concise, catchy songs. You can reference, sections from songs where the energy picks up. Is that could have been something, but not often enough. Again, it goes on far too long. And it feels, to me, it's just self-repetition. This is not musical evolution by any stretch of the imagination. Well, there you have it, okay? A lot of these albums, especially since, post-2000, they've been big, they've been ambitious, often very good in places, but they're predictable and overblown. Those same galloping riffs and same extended epics. It's solid, it's professional, but there's very little magic involved in this. So not that these albums are bad per se. I'm sure they're better than a lot of stuff that's being released, etc., etc. And most of them are punctuated here and there with good songs. But as a whole, no. As a whole, these albums do not work for me. And, for the reasons I have given. And it is maybe not that just Iron Maiden became worse or something. Maybe they just became themselves. Maybe this is what they always wanted to be. They just never had the confidence, to be so self-indulgent in the past. Or perhaps Martin Birch would not let them be that self-indulgent in the past. Who knows? But, endlessly repeating what they had perfected decades ago, it just seems to me a rather pointless exercise. They've become craftsmen now. They're no longer discoverers or explorers or pioneers. I mean, I have to admit that, maybe I changed as well. My taste certainly changed, where I used to get off on them, back in the early days. Maybe, as you're discovering things for the first time, it's fresh, the energy, the imagery now, but now, because they haven't progressed, you've heard it all before, So what once felt revolutionary and compelling, demanding even, now just feels familiar, and I have to say, tired. Still, I mean, there's something to admire about their consistency, their production, their musicianship, and their dedication, all that is undeniable. I just want to touch on one little issue here. I've said that since Bruce came back in the subsequent albums, Iron Maiden have gone prog. I disagree. Repetition does not equal progression in any sense. And the latter-day Maiden songs may be long, which is a hallmark of some prog, a lot of prog, but length alone does not make music progressive or songs progressive. And I say much of what Iron Maiden have dished up is repetition, which is often perhaps mistaken for grandeur. Ideas are stretched rather than developed. Lost sense of direction. Between 1980 and 1988, they were evolving consistently from, raw metal into, more intricate compositions, storytelling, epic songs, etc. Since then, they've settled into a formula, mistaking familiarity perhaps for maturity. But again, this is not prog rock, The songs are just unnecessarily long with the same acoustic intro or outro. production without restraint. They sound, I mean, again, they sound fine. They sound large, big, bombastic, but perhaps lacking dynamics, I don't know. Without a strong producer to challenge them, I made this point before, their indulgence has seemingly gone unchecked, and I do not think that is a good thing. Seems to me that every idea gets used, whether or not it deserves to be used or not. And then, stagnation over evolution, they have not advanced. No, they keep regurgitating the same type of idea. They've just drawn them out to be even more interminable. But very little energy, very little urgency. They don't convey either, particularly to me. And that very defined, sharp melodic sense. Think of something like "The Prisoner" or something. It was a heavy driving song, but it had great, melodic foundations. Don't hear much of that anymore, do you? Too often these things have been, the modern or their later stuff is sort of mid-tempo sprawl. And as much as quantity over impact, there might be flashes of brilliance here and there, but the new material just doesn't cut it. It feels forced. It's epic in length, but not in spirit. Not in construction, or not in design or desire. Maybe it's not that they just grew old. Maybe they just grew too comfortable with themselves. The fire that once drove them to redefine, now fuels repetition instead of reinvention. What they need is not nostalgia or grandeur, but I think is discipline. Again, we're coming back. Maybe that external producer, to encourage them to cut, refine, to rediscover, to edit, to sharpen the edges, to focus more. Things they once, if you go back to, their golden years, something, they did over a 10-year period almost, 8 albums. So no, to answer my question at the beginning, they did not fulfill their musical potential. We'll ignore the declining years, as I style them, because most bands have had a dip, especially bands with such a long career. But certainly they had the opportunity when Bruce and Adrian returned to go on to do something, to become something special. Didn't happen, did it? Why? I don't know, and this is pure speculation. So I've never been as invested in Iron Maiden as I have been in other bands, but one gets the feeling that perhaps the internal dynamics and creative direction of very much do what Steve Harris says. The principal songwriter, now effectively producer. It's his vision that increasingly defines every record. Perhaps that limits the creative tension, I don't know, that's maybe often essential for, to produce better work or sharpened ideas. Sometimes a little bit of conflict, I have a good idea, you have a good idea, we bounce them around and a third and better idea emerges. Maybe that's not happening anymore, I don't know. I mean, the band claim to share input, but there's always been one of those bands, because they're very particular on the songwriting credits. A lot of bands, quite democratic about it, and just because he's the drummer, he was actually in the room while we were developing this, and he did make suggestions. He contributed to the writing of the song, but no, they've always been very, very particular about who wrote what. And it seems that it's becoming, increasingly, the Steve Harris show. And I think anybody else who submits an idea is already, has much experience in knowing which of their ideas will be accepted and which will not. So, whether directly or indirectly, he's calling the shots. Comfort, legacy, mindset, long-term success, loyal fan base, nothing to prove, no external pressure to innovate, or even to be self-critical, They put them out, the people buy them, the concert tickets are snapped up. Interesting to consider Bruce Dickinson's role because, well, whatever you may think or not think of his solo career, he was, a creative artist. His own right, and you have to, does he, is he somehow stifled here? Or has he just accepted that this is what it is, and when he feels the need to express himself, he records a solo album or something. It's fine. I mean, it's a perfectly legitimate compromise, Just because you're an accountant by day does not mean that you cannot, fulfill yourself creatively with amateur dramatics in the evening or something like that. I mean, it's fine to do that, but, obviously the paycheck, being in Iron Maiden, allows you to go off on your own occasionally and, indulge yourself. Perfectly legitimate. But again, as a fundamental point, it's, I think, certainly since the return of, I should probably say since, when was the last album? What was the last album Martin Birch produced? Fear of the Dark. That since then they have, I think, you just listening to these, there is a crying need for a strong personality in the studio with them. So I said, no. Did they lose their creative spark after Seventh Son? Or did I, in this case, simply outgrow them? Yeah, it's probably a bit of both. I still think the 1980s albums, stand up really strong. I won't say masterpieces, but they're really great records of their genre. And, latterly I have to respect the band for, not compromising on their identity. They've stayed true to who they are, even if the magic feels forced now. Or perhaps there is no magic anymore. Anyway, that is my opinion. What do you think? Did Iron Maiden evolve? Or did they stagnate? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this reflection, hit like, subscribe, share, all those other good things for more deep dives into classic rock and metal. So as usual, I thank you for your indulgence. I wish you well. And until next time, Maçhonquèrre.